Hi, Rob B here with Rob D, and welcome back to the Property Podcast. It's episode 230, and this week we've got 13 surprising facts about the UK rental market. But the bit I'm more excited about, Rob D finally has a rant.
Yeah, I've been storing it up for over 4 years and it's going to be unleashed today. So you got that to look forward to. But also the facts that we're going to be going through. There's some really fascinating stuff on there. If you are sitting on a chair, prepare to fall off it in surprise. Hopefully we're not building up too much. So before I can hype it any further, let's come back to reality. And something we can say for sure is that, Rob, meetups were last night and you were hanging out with the good people of Bournemouth. How was it?
It was great. Really nice crowd. Very relaxed. Big thank you to Nick, who runs the meetup there. He does a brilliant job. It's a great crowd, lovely people. Really nice to get down here. Who would have thought it was the summer when I arrived in Bournemouth? But actually it wasn't. It was actually awful weather when I arrived. This morning, I'm still in Bournemouth as we record this. It's actually very nice, which is a shame because I'm leaving today. But Rob, I must admit, while people were keen to talk to me, a lot of people wanted to know where you are. I think we've touched on it in the past, but people get a bit worried when they don't get an update on your location. And you're not in London right now, are you?
No, I'm not. I'm in Rotterdam at the moment. I'm actually watching a massive cruise ship sail past my window, which is pretty cool. Yeah, I'm enjoying it out here. I'm popping back to London soon, then I think off again. We will see. I like to keep people guessing. Don't like to stay in one place for too long. But I was sorry to miss the meetups because they are always good fun. So I look forward to getting along to one soon. But one day coming up when you can definitely pin me down to a particular location is going to be the 9th of September, because that is when we are having our Property Hub Summit up in Manchester.
Yes, there's only a few places left for that, so if you would like to see Rob D or connect with a high-level network and learn a lot and progress dramatically as a property investor as well, then please do come along. Check out the link, thepropertyhub.net/summit. What was really interesting, there was people there last night in Bournemouth who are investing in like Manchester and Stockport. For people who aren't from Manchester or in the immediate area, maybe you're in the southeast or London and you've been thinking about Manchester or the north in general as an investment area, then this is the ideal opportunity to double up. Go to the summit, build a great network with people who are active in that market, and, of course, spend some time, maybe the next day or the previous day, checking out the area, getting to know the local property market. So if you do go forward with it, you know a little bit more.
Yeah, so that's coming up in just a few weeks. There, we've got one in November in London, which is almost sold out. I think there might be one place left. And then that is it for the year. These are going really quickly because we've halved the numbers. There's now only 8 people coming to each session. So you get to know everyone there really well and you get loads of personal attention. So get over to thepropertyhub.net/summit if you are interested in that. Okay, so on to our topic of the week, 13 surprising facts about the UK rental market. So this is all based around the English Housing Survey. This is a document that comes out every year, put out by the government, which is absolutely packed full of statistics about the rental market. So we're going to link to the actual report in the show notes this week, which you'll find at thepropertyhub.net/rentfacts. So the link to everything will be there, but we've pulled out what we think are the most interesting, surprising, and relevant findings, and we're going to take you through those now with a bit of commentary. So before we get into this, I think it's important to say again that this is an official government publication. It's very robust. The sample was 13,500 households. So it's a pretty serious piece of work. And the reason I say that is that not all reports you see will be quite so robust, and that will become relevant later. But let's not get into all that now. Let's look at some of these facts. And Rob, let's start with some of the basics and just look at the size and the makeup of the rental sector.
So we're not starting slow with these facts because this first one, while I can see why it's happened, it's just staggering. So 4.5 million households are now in the private rental sector. That's 20% of households. Well, why is that staggering? That's up from 12% in 2006. In just over a decade, it's jumped from 12 to 20%. That's a huge shift in how we are living today in the UK and how things are dramatically changing in the housing sector. 12 to 20%, and I think the trend will continue that way. So an incredible stat there to start with. Really interesting. It's no surprise that it's grown, but just by how fast. Now, in addition to that, there's 24% of those renters received housing benefit, but only 5% of them had their full rent covered by the housing benefit. And 74% of that group of people were working.
Yeah, so I think what's interesting about that latter number is that you'll often see people advertising for tenants saying no housing benefit. Well, it turns out if you say no housing benefit, you're cutting off a quarter of the market. So that is a big number and something to think about.
Although you open up a can of worms there, Rob, because a lot of people aren't happy with what the government did with the changes. You can see why it's making it more and more difficult for people to go down that route. So, well, you're right, 1 in 4 is huge, and you are shutting yourself off to a potentially really strong market. If the government continues to make it more difficult for landlords, you can see why they're hesitant to go down that route. But that's probably a chat for another day, maybe another podcast.
It might actually be a podcast for another day. Make a note of that. That is definitely something worth talking about. Well, that ties in nicely to the next area that we're going to look at, which is the ability of tenants to pay rent. As a landlord, this is something that you probably care about quite a lot. So, how much do tenants spend on rent? So, on average, households in the private rented sector spend 35% of their income on rent, which actually is a little bit lower than I thought it would be, because there's this old kind of rule, if you call it that, but not really, that you should spend about a third of your income on housing. And everyone talks about how high rents are. So 35% is more than a third, but only just. What's really interesting, though, is when you look at London versus the rest of the country. So in London, households were spending 45% of their pay on rent. And when you exclude London and look just at the rest of the country, it's 32%. So not a major shock, but it's still quite surprising when you see this difference in figures. In London, basically knocking on for half your pay goes in rent. Everywhere else, things are actually looking fairly affordable. And that's borne out by the next statistic as well. When asked, 71% of people said that they found it fairly easy or very easy to find the money to pay their rent, which is good news if you're a landlord. However, in London, that number falls to 41%. So again, a huge change. 71% to 41%, that is absolutely massive. And again, it builds up this picture of London being massively expensive and everywhere else being quite affordable. And another very important statistic for you as a landlord is how many tenants have been in arrears in the last year. And the study showed that 9% of private renters had been in arrears during the last year, compared to 25% of social renters, which is a bit of an aside, but still surprising. 9%. So that basically means that you've got a 1 in 10 chance of having a tenant in arrears. Of course, that doesn't tell you how serious those arrears are. It could have just been a week late by 50 quid, or it could have been something far more serious. But still, basically 1 in 10. And so maybe in the light of that statistic, you might want to be thinking about rent guarantee insurance, depending on whether that number is higher or lower than you were expecting it to be.
Yeah, 9% is a little bit higher than we see at yellow letting. So it's surprising. Maybe because the areas we operate, the tenant profile is possibly less risky. So I was a little bit surprised it was as high as 9%. What isn't surprising, though, because the trend in some of this data has already been shown this, is London is expensive. So the mean weekly rent is £184 overall. But when you break it down regionally, London is £300. But outside of London, it's pretty much half that number. It's only £135. Now, people may be thinking, well, you get more wages in London. You do, but not double. The average wage in London isn't double everywhere else, but the rent is. So again, it shows affordability when people say, oh, homes and renting or buying homes, wherever, isn't affordable. They're probably just talking about London, maybe the southeast, but actually affordability elsewhere is pretty reasonable. Now, a scary stat for you. 2/3, 66% of private renters have no savings whatsoever. Of the third who did, 41% of them had savings of under £5,000, which actually, again, has been reflected in the data. We are spending more money, and there is no real incentive to save at the moment with what the banks are returning. Not everybody is a property investor. Not everybody is saving for a property where they can get higher returns. So if you're looking at your ISA and it's paying out 1.5%, or you can go shopping, you can see why people do it. I'm not saying that's the right thing to do, but you can see why. There's no incentive there. But the fact is, people are a few days away from being bankrupt or broke. Some time off work or some other unfortunate personal circumstance could mean these people could be in trouble very quickly or start racking up debt very quickly. So a bit of a scary start, that one.
It really is. It's terrifying, actually. And also, if you're upset about the ban in letting fees that's going to be coming in, well, maybe you'll have a bit more sympathy. Because clearly, if 2/3 of tenants have got no savings, then it's going to be really hard for them to move because they've got to find the deposit, the first month's rent. And if they get whacked with a few £100 worth of fees as well, that could be make or break. So really interesting stuff. Now, here's what for me was actually the most surprising number of all. So there's some good stats around the length of the tenancy and how satisfied tenants are. So the average tenancy length. Do you want to have a guess? Get a number in your mind for what you think the average length of a tenancy in the private rented sector is.
Can I have a go, Rob?
Oh, go for it, yeah.
Is it, I don't know, 4.3 years?
That is a suspiciously exact number that you've come up with, Rob, and in fact is bang on the nose. I think you might have been reading ahead. But yes, the average length of a tenancy is indeed 4.3 years. I don't know about you, but it's a lot longer than I thought it would be. So that's good news if you are maybe not a property investor yet, but thinking about building a portfolio. It's encouraging that you could have long-term tenants. And also super relevant because there's so much talk about how landlords should be forced to offer longer tenancies. Well, clearly landlords are very happy for tenancies to run for a long time, as long as the rent's being paid and the property's being looked after. 4.3 is a big number. Now, that's higher than we see on average at yellow lettings. Again, it's because of the type of stock and the type of location. So we're mainly dealing with city centre properties with tenants who are younger, more mobile, more frequently having changes of family circumstance, changes of job. It's easier for them to move around. So we see our tenancies as being shorter. So when I saw that number, it took me by surprise a little bit.
Yeah, me too, Rob. I think, again, because I'm exposed to the same sort of data you are, 4.3 was a lot higher. I've had tenants stay that long and longer, but you remember them because of how long they've stayed. So 4.3 as an average was very surprising.
Yeah, exactly. Now, something else which I think is highly relevant, and again, something that runs counter to some of the things that you might have seen, is when it comes to satisfaction with accommodation. So 82% of tenants say that they are satisfied with their accommodation. Some of them are somewhere in the middle, and only 10% are actively dissatisfied. So of course that number is too high. You want everyone to be satisfied with where they live. But if you're reading the papers, you might have the impression that it's much higher than that. So 10% actually is lower than I thought it would be. And also 13% of social renters are dissatisfied with their accommodation. So private landlords are actually doing better than social landlords on that count, which isn't something that you might have thought. You see the same thing when it comes to repairs as well. So of those tenants who had repairs carried out in the last 12 months, 18% were dissatisfied with how it was done. Now, obviously that's way higher than it should be. But again, 22% of social renters were unhappy with how it had been handled. So on both those measures, lots of room for improvement, but private landlords doing pretty well.
You make a great point, Rob, about the media, because the media loves to paint a picture that landlords are evil barons. We all count our money and laugh loudly as it pours into our bank accounts. As you and I know, and everyone listening, it's far from the case. But it's great that the data backs it up. And here's a bit more data that backs it up. So the report also asked people why their last tenancy ended. 73% said because they wanted to. They wanted to move on. 11% had it ended by the landlord. So again, lots of reports about landlords just kicking people out for the sake of it. 1 in 10, not that high. I'd like to see it lower, but not, as bad as the media is making out. Now, the part that really got my attention was only 2% of tenants left because of rent increases. So again, those greedy landlords, where are they? There's not many of them, clearly. 2% is a tiny number. And then the media would make you believe that landlords are constantly pushing up rents to squeeze every last drop out of a tenant. The data shows it clearly isn't the case. There are a small minority, and that's what we always say. There are a small minority that ruin it for the rest, and they're the ones who get the headlines. But the data shows a very different picture. And of those 11% that were ended by the landlord, 63% were because the landlord wanted to sell or use the property themselves. Again, it doesn't look like landlords are being vindictive to move people on because they're not getting what they want. Again, the media would show a different picture. So we end up with a few stats towards the end, Rob, that actually paints landlords in a fairly positive light. And it shows that most people have a good relationship with their tenants.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And that's why I found these numbers really encouraging, as well as surprising, because it shows that most tenants are happy. Most landlords seem to be setting rent at affordable levels. And while satisfaction rates aren't as high as they could be, they're actually higher than in the social sector. So all that's looking pretty good. But this starts taking us into rant territory. We're on the verge of it because this study, the English Housing Survey, you probably hadn't heard of it until we flagged it up. It hasn't really been reported very much in the media. But there's another report that you might have seen in the media that presents landlords in a completely different light. So are you ready for this?
Oh, I'm so ready, Rob. I'm just going to kick my feet back, sip my coffee, and listen to you go. But before you do, I think you're completely justified.
Okay, so, well, you can make your own mind up when you listen to this. Okay, so around the same time this survey came out, there was another report that came out from the Roundtree Foundation. So we'll link to it in the show notes, which are at thepropertyhub.net/rentfacts, so you can go and have a read of it yourself. But this was reported in The Guardian. The headline, when The Guardian reported on this report, was, "Landlords are turfing people out of their homes without reason, and it's completely legal." So that was the headline. Sounds a little bit different from the stats that we just ran through. Let's look at why that might be the case. So to start out with, let's look at the methodology for how the Roundtree Foundation did this report. So they did two things. First of all, they did a review of the literature. Most of that literature, though, was from 2008, which is out of date because the laws around things like revenge evictions have changed since then. So that's not too helpful. The other thing they did was they did 145 interviews. So remember, the previous survey had a sample size of about 15,000. This was 145 people. They recruited these people through shelter housing offices. Is it surprising that if you go to shelter housing offices, you'll find people who are having trouble with their housing? More than that, they specifically chose to go to offices in areas that they thought were particularly challenging in terms of housing issues. So already you can completely throw this out in terms of having any kind of validity, because in any serious piece of research, you're not meant to be deciding on what you want to find out before you even start. You're meant to look at the data, then have your conclusion at the end, not the beginning. One section even reports on reasons why tenants believe that they were evicted, which is not particularly helpful because a tenant's belief isn't the same as the actual reason. So that's the methodology, which is enough to kind of write it off in itself. But then they also completely twist some of the figures. So at one point it says that just under a quarter of current tenants reported that their last move was forced in some way and not because they wanted to move. So a quarter, well, that's higher than we saw earlier. It turns out that under that quarter, they include mutual agreement. Mutual agreement doesn't sound very forced to me. Or the tenancy was for a fixed period, or that the property was provided by their job and the job ended. None of that sounds very forced to me. If you exclude those, you get down to 10%, which is the same number we saw earlier. That's 1 in 10 versus 1 in 4. Quite a big difference. And also at one point, they quote a study by Shelter, not known as a pro-landlord activist group, that actually goes against exactly what they're trying to show. The Shelter quote says, landlords in the survey who'd removed a tenant from a property in the last 3 years, the most commonly cited reasons were rent arrears of at least 2 months' rent or antisocial behaviour, including damage to the property, accounting for 46% and 26% of actions, respectively. So just those two reasons, antisocial behaviour and rent arrears, get you up to 3/4 before you even start digging into other reasons. Does that seem unreasonable? Does it seem unreasonable that you'd want to kick out a tenant because they weren't paying the rent or they're damaging the property? It just completely undermines the conclusion that they're trying to draw. So it really feels like they decided at the start what they wanted to find, went out, tried to find it, and then couldn't quite manage to find it by looking at the data, but worded it in such a way anyway that made you think that they did. And the reason that this annoys me so much is that this is what most people are reading. So the numbers that we pulled out earlier for the bulk of this episode, we actually had to go and dig through this 100-page document to find them. Whereas what gets reported in The Guardian and elsewhere that most people will read, landlords are turfing people out of their homes without reason. Obviously, as a landlord, you're going to have a slightly sore point about it. Even if you take that out of the picture, I just don't see how it is helpful to paint one group of people as being a problem in some way, when, of course, sometimes they are, but in a lot of cases, they're not. Mic drop.
Whoa. I love it, Rob. I'm glad you did go through that because I would have gone off just as much. It's an absolute disgrace. The longer we've done the podcast, the more I've learned how the media just cannot be trusted with pretty much anything, really. And they will craft stories or use stories or manipulate stories to tell a story that will sound the most dramatic rather than what's true. And I understand they've got a job to do. And I understand all journalists aren't the same. And I understand they're pressured to do what they do. That all being said, the amount of times we've picked apart articles or we've picked apart headlines, and then you go into the article and you see it's absolutely got nothing to do with what the headline's suggesting, is actually now just getting bordering on ridiculous. And that's only in stuff that's related to us, property and economy and maybe business. But I'm sure in every single field and sector, I'm sure politics is a very good one, they're doing exactly the same thing over and over again. Which is why we ram home all the time. Don't let the media be your investment advisor, because the headlines you'll see and the things they'll suggest or tell you to do are almost certainly going to be the wrong things.
Yeah, absolutely. So see, there was a broader point there after all. It wasn't just me having a moan. Thank you, Rob, for bringing that out. So there you go. I hope you've found this episode as interesting as we did. There's a lot in there that wasn't quite as we would have expected. So what jumped out to you? Well, get over to the Property Hub and let us know. Lots to discuss in there. So if that wasn't quite enough for you, we've got a resource of the week coming up with yet more numbers. But before we get to that, let's have a break from numbers and have some words instead, and hopefully some kind words in the form of an iTunes review.
Alrighty, a huge thank you to these two outstanding people. First off is John Muck from Hearts, and John says, R&R, I've stumbled on the podcast 6 weeks ago. I am now hooked and on episode number 90 of the back catalogue. An amazing resource and highly motivational in all areas of property and business in general. Great advice and great pointers to further my knowledge, whether it's through the resource of the week or book recommendations. Thanks from myself and my family's future pension. Love it. Thank you, John. And Richard says, thanks for your positive property information on the podcast. Having worked in property for years, it would be easy to turn into Chicken Little, but the positive information and the long-term vision of property is a great way to avoid slumping into negativity. Keep up the good work. And a brilliant point there, Richard. Talking about this a lot, but when things get tough in property or in life in general, in business, wherever, go back to the big picture. Go back to the why you're doing this. Tough days will happen. Challenges will happen. But if you focus on why you're doing it in the first place, it'll get you through those tougher days and into that brighter future. What a nice way to end the podcast. But we're not quite ended yet, Rob, are we? Because we've got another resource.
Yeah, we have. So this is one that you've popped into the notes, Rob, but I believe you're trying to take the credit for someone else's work there.
That's so unusual. Now, this is from Damien Potnell. Thank you, Damien. Damien tweeted me this week. In fact, Rob, I see even you tweeting this week. I was looking for the apocalypse coming, but apparently you just found your Twitter account, which was great to see. But Damien tweeted this resource over, and it's a good one. It's a look at the private rental market again. So if you haven't had enough of stats, we've got more for you. We'll link to it in the show notes, but it goes a little bit further and looks at some different type of data to what we've discussed already. It breaks down even more so regionally the rents of a particular area. It looks at the bedrooms and what's popular and how much they rent for as well. Gives you an idea of what different types of homes rent for in a particular region. So for example, you can go to the East Midlands and see what a room, a studio, a 1-bed, a 2-bed, a 3-bed, or 4 beds or more houses rent for. So lots of data there. If you're a bit of a data geek, you're going to love this week and obviously this resource too. And of course, you will find all of that in our show notes, which you probably want to look at because there is lots of facts and information. And this week you'll find them at thepropertyhub.net/rent facts. That's rent facts.
Okay, so I think we need to head off for a lie down at this point. I certainly do. But there's just time to let you know what's coming up next week. So this week seemed on the face of it like it was kind of a more like general interest kind of episode. Although actually there are things in there that you can use to make decisions based on. So for example, the statistic on the number of tenants who've been in arrears might get you thinking differently about your own portfolio. But next week we're going to be giving you an episode that is directly packed full of things you can use. We're looking at 5 unusual ways to find the perfect tenant. Clearly, finding the right tenant is so important. It's an absolutely critical part of the overall picture. There are some ways of finding tenants that everyone knows about, and there are some that we're pretty sure that you won't. So we'll be giving you 5 of those next week.
And before that, we'll be back with Ask Rob and Rob on Tuesday. And remember, if you're interested in our summits, there's only a few places left for the year. It's not one of these that when they're gone, we'll relaunch some more. It's it. It's done. So if you check the page and it's sold out, I'm sorry, that's done. But if you still want to join us and there's places left, go to thepropertyhub.net/summit and check it out. So that leaves us one task to do, Rob, which is say goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to The Property Podcast. For show notes, all our past episodes, and to leave a review, go to thepropertyhub.net/podcast.